Such a delight to have Laura back on the show. We don't spend enough time, as always, on this podcast covering the global nature of regeneration. And we end up spending a lot of airtime, talking about the global north. So what has been happening in Mexico and the rest of the Spanish-speaking countries in LATAM? They hold the key for many of our biodiversity challenges and opportunities. And many of the tropical or subtropical commodities are farmed there. What has she learned since the last time we spoke 3 years ago, and why did she decide to start a $20 million investment fund focused on rural Mexico and the regenerative transition? This is the Investing in Regenerative Agriculture and Food podcast, Investing as if the planet mattered, where we talk to the pioneers in the regenerative food and agriculture space to learn more on how to put our money to work to regenerate soil, people, local communities, and ecosystems while making an appropriate and fair return. Why my focus on soil and regeneration? Because so many of the pressing issues we face today have their roots in how we treat our land and our sea, grow our food, what we eat, where and consume. And it's time that we as investors, big and small, and consumers start paying much more attention to the dirt/soil underneath our feet. To make it easy for fans to support our work, we launched our membership community, and so many of you have joined us as a member. Thank you. If our work created value for you, and if you have the means, and only if you have the means, consider joining us. Find out more on gumroad.com/investing-in-regen-ag. That is gumroad.com/investing-in-regen-ag, or find the link below. Welcome to another episode, today with the Chief Purpose Officer and co-founder of SVX Mexico and managing partner at Regenera Ventures, which invests in the transition for regenerative agriculture and regenerative land use in rural Mexico. Welcome back, Laura.
Thank you, Cohen. Thank you for having me.
So we chatted I checked it obviously, in the summer of 2021, or the end of the summer of 2021, which feels like a lifetime ago. We're currently recording in the Northern Hemisphere, and also the, let's say, autumn/winter in the Northern Hemisphere. It's November 2024, which feels in regen ag and food systems a lifetime ago. So I'm very happy to check in with you, and we have a lot to cover. But first of all, just for people that didn't listen to the other one, which of course I will link below, a short introduction into your work and what led you to focus specifically on rural Mexico and specifically on regeneration.
Thank you so much, Cohen. So I used to be a banker. This was 10 years ago. I was in both asset management and wealth management in Mexico. And as you can imagine, it was a very toxic culture, a very masculine culture, one of those old school, very industry-driven cultures that always ask more of you and that drive you to burnout. And so over 10 years ago, I had a life-changing moment and decided, that if I die tomorrow, I don't want to just have made the rich richer. So I really wanted to, restructure my life, especially professionally, and really find out my purpose. And I had no idea that impact investing existed. And then I went into that rabbit hole back in 2014. But when I first started in impact investing, everything and anything could be impact. And so I really needed a Northern Star. I really needed direction. Back in 2016, I met John Fullerton from the Capital Institute. And so he's, I would say, one of the fathers of the regenerative economy thinking. And I also met the year after that with Carol Sanford and many other leaders that
You've met some good people in that year. Yeah, that's been a good 12 months in that case. In terms of really, how do you want to go deep in, like going from 0 to 100 in 2 seconds? That's probably your deep dive. Yeah. Wow.
Exactly. So I think that drove me to put my hands in the soil for the first time. That drove me into understanding soil and living systems thinking and all of that. So I think that became my Northern Star. And so from impact investing, that was very broad. And SVX, that is an impact investing advisory firm, really driving towards regeneration as our direction, I would say. And so how we have applied that in our thinking, in the way that we advise, and in the way we question not only investment paradigms, but also finance and economic paradigms. And so from that, we also had the amazing opportunity of working with the Biodiversity Finance Initiative in UNDP. And they were really trying to discover what was investable from biodiversity and like changing the paradigm of biodiversity no longer being perceived as a charity case. Because in Mexico and Latin America, it was very much the case. I think it still is, that biodiversity seen or regarded as a charity case, and like changing that mindset into seeing biodiversity not only as an investable asset, but actually seeing it as everyone's only life insurance. And so seeing that the insurers of our life are really, the custodians of biodiversity. And so basically, all of that realization was gradual. It took several years, but it definitely gave our company and myself clear direction. And so now our mission is that we want to ensure that capital serves life instead of governing it. And that has been, the mission in the past several years. It's almost been a decade now of work. And so, that evolution has been with a lot of learning, but also with a lot of unlearning.
That's a really good point. I mean, I love the phrase capital serving life. And I remember actually you mentioning your driver also back then. I don't want to make the rich necessarily richer, which I think is sort of the biggest driver of the financial system until now, or a big chunk of it at least. And it's definitely not serving life. And so what was... Let's unpick the unlearning piece a bit. What's the biggest unlearning lesson? Not to ask the biggest lesson you learned, but the biggest one you had to unlearn from your work in banking, and you're applying now your financial skills to facilitating more life.
Yeah, so I think I was educated in the fact that, we always want a generic form of more. Like always wanting more, right? When you reach certain amount of income, you always want double that or triple that or whatever. So I think I was educated to always want more. And I've been unlearning and re-educating myself to know the meaning of enough and to get my head around enoughness, get my head around balance and get my head around what is desirable from enough and from balance, rather than a generic form of more that keeps us eternally unsatisfied. And so I think that has been a huge unlearning process. But the other unlearning process has been from exponential growth as being this desirable goal or desirable destination, into actually thinking that in nature, and this is from Kate Raworth, in nature, growth is lovely when you see a baby growing up to be an adolescent and an adult, but that happens in the first 2 decades of your life. And after the first 2 decades of your life, you mature. You don't grow, to 4 meters tall when you're 40. This year I turned 40. And so I think I've been very much reflecting on how does maturity look like for the economy, for finance instead of growth. And also the other reflection is that we as humanity has become the means for the eternal reproduction of money. And so one of the bigger questions of, let's say, someone like Jed Emerson, that is a very, I would say, game-changing author of impact investing, that is, what is the purpose of capital, has really been a question that I've been learning and unlearning with throughout many years now, about if humanity has become the means towards the reproduction of money, or if really capital can be the liberation of humanity's potential and life flourishing. And so I think...
Let's just think that for a minute, because we're 7.5 minutes in and we're going straight to the deep end, which I love.
Philosophy.
Straight to the deep end of the pool. But it's a very deep one. Have we just become slaves of the money, to put it in different terms? And how, and it's something we wrestle with the podcast as well. Is money a tool? And probably it is. And we've been using it really, really well to not facilitate life. So could we also use it? But it comes with such tension and such narratives around exponential growth and such narratives around more and enough, there's never enough, etc., etc. Like, can we, like, is it almost too powerful to dance with, and will we fall into those traps? What do you see there? What do you feel there? Because we have this lure of money that is, and greed that is extremely strong. And maybe it's just are we in the adolescent phase, like Charles Eisenstein likes to say, and are we maturing? Should we mature now and go through another phase, and then we can manage that greed, or we can manage those tensions? What do you see there?
So I think we need to acknowledge that we can finance our way into extinction. We need to acknowledge that the inherent compound interest that goes into money creation is kind of the poison pill of life. Because we are creating a debt, and we are, like building all of our systems based on that debt. And so I think we have created an excess of financial capital at the cost and at the liquidation of the social and the natural capital. And so the problem with that is that you cannot do a click and that axiom that energy is never built or destroyed, but rather it is transformed. I think we have transformed so much of the social and natural capital into financial capital, but you cannot click your way back to a hectare of rainforest. It's not a click away. And so I think we do need to turn that excess financial capital back into natural capital and social capital. But we have many mental constraints, like the fact that saving the world has to be within a business model, the fact that we have to monetize this crisis, in our last decade of being able to do so. There's a ton of mental constraints that I use a metaphor of the fact that an Excel spreadsheet has a cell, and a cell becomes a jail of our minds. It becomes a prison of our minds. And it has really imprisoned our minds so much that we are desiring that double-digit return more than we are valuing clean air, drinkable rivers, and nourishing soils. So for me, those are the wild returns. The wild returns are that, the clean air, the drinkable rivers, and the community. And so we've lost all that because we're imprisoned in an Excel spreadsheet.
Which is pretty sad if you think about it.
Yeah.
I mean, probably never what the designer of Excel or the programmer at Microsoft or whoever came up with it envisioned. But we're a prisoner in an Excel cell.
The good thing is that it's a mental construct. That's the good thing. It's part of our imagination. Like, compound interest is not physics. It's part of our imagination, and we can imagine otherwise.
And so how have you, this is all the unlearning, and how have you seen like the learning pieces with all the investors and entrepreneurs you've worked with over the last almost decade? How has it been landing? How have you been? Because I remember, I think the title we chose last time was how to make investors and financiers fall in love with biodiversity of LATAM. And how has it been going? What have been surprises, insights on that journey of getting people to unlearn that they're, let's see, looking over the edge of the Excel cell to maybe the neighboring one, or actually be on the sheet, just to be super wild.
Yeah. So I remember actually back then when at the end of the podcast, you asked me who I could refer you to speak. And I remember that I referred you to Reginald Hazlet Marroquin. And I'm really glad that you guys now, have connected in many ways. So I think one of the wise words of Reggie, he's always saying that we need to look at things differently because we find, new things or new opportunities or new approaches once we look at them differently. And so I have really seen that natural capital and a lot of nature-based solutions are not only underinvested and undervalued, but really the best multi-purpose investment for everyone. And so some of the findings have been, that sometimes when we're looking for things that are called regenerative agriculture in, for example, southeastern Mexico, where you have a ton of smallholder farmer agriculture and a lot of indigenous wisdom, it is not called regenerative agriculture. It's called agroecology or so many other names. But really it carries the wisdom of going from a domination dynamic or domination paradigm of nature to an interdependent dynamic or paradigm, right? And so, I mean, it comes from a lot of other vertices of wisdom, much more than that. But really, I have found that, we don't need to come and impose a new intervention or a new way, rather see and recognize a lot of this wisdom, how it is already playing out in many of these landscapes, because the resistance to the industrial agriculture model had always been there. And so, for example, just last year, we visited smallholder agriculture and producers from southern Oaxaca. And this is not only vulnerable to climate vulnerability, but also to earthquakes. And so, they need to rebuild and rebuild and rebuild. And so, like, looking at how climate resilience has become economic resilience in practice and not theoretically, these are coffee farmers that were usually driven towards a coffee farming mentality precisely because of the margin that you can find in coffee and the place where they were that was very apt for that, and how that has been so vulnerable to the single price of a commodity that they have been adapting, and they have been, growing cocoa that is actually native from their ecosystems. They have been diversifying into a really special honey that is a keystone species of their ecosystems. They have been diversifying into poultry, vanilla, and so many wild species that they have found around their ecosystems. And so I think one of the huge surprises for me is that we are not coming here to impose any new ways or new models, but rather learning to see and finding them and partnering with them. And so learning that we're not here in a paternalistic intervention kind of way, but rather in a partnering with the regenerators that are already present.
And you have been expanding to another country, to Colombia, recently, or not so recent, but at least you're not only you've done always a lot of work in the rest of the continent as well, but most of it was focused on Mexico. And how is regeneration, of course, different? It might be called slightly different, but what are lessons there from looking at it in another country, another context, another history, quite far, of course, like, let's say, another landscape and another soil types as well. What are your lessons there, or what are your insights from basically putting SVX into another country?
Yeah, so we've been working all throughout Latin America, but I would say it has been so special to work in Colombia, and precisely coming from this Mexican perspective, because I have always thought, like, if you see the geography of where Mexico is, it is literally, it could be a portal between the global north and the global south. And we are like a bridge, between South America and North America. And so we ourselves become like translators, or we ourselves become bridges of these two realities. And so I would say in the global north, we have a huge context of, like, trust is based on intellectual trust and relationships, and like in the global south, it's a lot about affective trust. And so Mexico has, I think, like a hybrid of those two. And in Colombia, there are so many nuances of being a tropical country that are similar to Mexico, but also contrasting. So, like, for example, over there, I just mentioned 2 weeks ago in Bogota, like, oh yeah, March, so it's going to be spring. And they're like, no, there's no spring here. I'm like, what do you mean there's no spring? And I totally forgot, that they were caught between El Niño and La Niña phenomenons of drought and floods, or drought season and rain season. And so they don't have that context of, like, very marked seasons for them because they're so close to the equator, right? So it's just like those tiny nuances that are so explicit and so present and so important to acknowledge the differences between, even though Mexico has a tropical part, it is really different for how Colombia works. And so I think we share a lot of context and and a lot of like the friendly dynamic between two countries. We really like each other, and there's a lot of Colombians working in Mexico, and there's a lot of Mexicans working in Colombia. But I think acknowledging those essential differences of what makes Colombia Colombia and Mexico Mexico is really also important. And so another thing that I feel different from the Mexico and Colombia context is that we're both Latin American countries, and Latin America has a lot of patriarch dynamics, but especially in Mexico, there's a name of a dynamic called macho, the macho country, like a toxic masculine dynamic of domination of women, that has played out. And I would say in Colombia, we really find a kind of women empowerment that we don't necessarily find in Mexico. And I say this precisely because within regeneration, I think there's a layer of reconciliation. And I think there has been a separation of the feminine and the masculine forces or energies, and like valuing the masculine energies more. And I think the diversity of both are really important and give the strength and the resilience into everything, that goes into the work of regeneration. But I think it really stands out that in Colombia, the women leadership is more, I would say, acknowledged and available and present than it is in Mexico. So I think we have a welcoming experience in Colombia that has been a little bit tougher in Mexican context.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of trauma and regeneration goes obviously, but still many people maybe miss that memo way beyond soil health and regeneration of X inches or whatever we take as measurement. But it's such a good Trojan horse to discuss, and I'm not saying fix, but to work on a lot of other things as well, because a lot of these things touch land ownership, access to finance, inequality in general, access to a lot of other things, and of course access to food and health and all of that, which really play out in a lot of these issues. And it all underlies like how we designed our food and land system and agriculture system. So you're saying in a sense it's slightly easier in Colombia? Is that what I'm hearing? Or slightly more, you say welcoming, but slightly easier landing in that sense?
More welcoming in terms of gender. But it's also challenging in the fact that we do need to, embed yourself in the context to be able to like not comment something that is not attuned with what they are expecting. So I would say it's just a very friendly atmosphere. We found it very welcoming so far, and we just really enjoy ourselves while we work with Colombians.
And is that one of the reasons, it's a perfect bridge to host or to focus there on a small event? I don't think it's going to be small. A small thing you're going to put together in March next year, in 2025, to go to Colombia, to focus. Like, let's talk a bit about Laris and why there, and why now, or why in 6 months, and why it's so important to bring the community together of all over LATAM, obviously, and beyond.
Yes. So I want to acknowledge the fact that we're recording this some weeks after the Biodiversity COP took place in Cali, Colombia. So I think 2024 marks the year that I hope natural capital becomes more of a
and next year
mainstream.
A big COP will be in the Amazon in Brazil. So
exactly.
you're on a nice streak there.
Exactly. But so I would say natural capital is putting itself on the map, and it's becoming mainstream, and finally the big asset managers and the big banks and all the financial world is finally not just looking at it, but finding the ways to apply it, or to invest in it, or so they're I think we're still very much in the nascent phase of how to make nature investable and biodiversity and da. And I want to say that the Amazon has been, of course, a very interesting keystone place to talk about in all these climate narratives and biodiversity narratives. But I do think since Brazil has, the biggest chunk in terms of land volume, usually Brazil takes a lot of the attention, time, and focus. And so the Spanish-speaking Latin America is usually left second. So I would say there's a bit of a tension there. There's a bit of a tension, in fact, that whenever you just type in regeneration Latin America, Brazil usually takes the protagonist role. And that is great. And I do acknowledge their role and their size and everything. But we do wanted to make Laris a way to bring about the focus to the Spanish-speaking Latin America, because there will be already several events going on in the Brazilian side of things, right? So, for example, in Latin America, I would say a big role into the narrative of regeneration has been played for by Sistema B, which is the big corporation movement in Latin America. And so the Sistema B has already been talking and putting front and center like regeneration as one of their main directions, I would say. And they do have a Sistema B event coming up in the second half of 2025 in Brazil, right? And so there's also the COP, and there's already a ton of things that will be happening in Brazil. And so we don't want to duplicate that, rather add value. And so focus, making sure that LATIS, which is actually the initials of Latin American Regenerative Investment Summit, which is the pioneer summit, the very first summit that's ever been done, to really build the investment case for the regenerative transition of Latin America, especially with an emphasis and focus on Spanish-speaking Latin America, not just Portuguese-speaking Latin America. So we will have Brazil present, of course, in Brazilian cases, but we want to make sure that we are highlighting and emphasizing the rest of Latin America, because we already know that a lot will be done in Brazil and by other types of events. And so right now the COP of biodiversity that just happened in Cali, some of our team members that were there, were really amazed at the fact that it was like the people's COP, the fact that the community was very much engaged, involved, participating, and front and center everywhere. So I think that really shows that Colombia and Latin America is recognizing the value of our biodiversity assets. And so I think 10 years ago, we were copy pasting models from the private capital industry, following the unicorn mentality and all of that. And we just wanted unicorns in Latin America or whatever. And I think we are now going into an evolution, a phase of a lot of the tech private capital accelerators are now morphing into impact climate, accelerators. And that really shows the evolution of how the region is even perceiving itself, I would say. So really valuing what is in our essence instead of following other models from, external sources. And so the importance that we want to make this event in Bogota is precisely because basically we have a ton of years of data, especially from the US investment case, that have been super helpful, and there's been I don't know if you saw the recent publication from the American Farmland Trust, but it's amazing, the return over investment per farm, and they have per commodity per state, and they average over 167% of return over investment. All those data points that have been going on for almost, I would say, more than 2 decades in the US, we don't have that for Latin America. So we really need to build our investment case. We really need to build our data points. We really need to build our examples. And so this event is coming together at the end of a 2-year collaboration that we've been mapping the regenerative agri-food entrepreneurs and companies and organizations all throughout Latin America, from Mexico to Argentina. This community has been called regenerativo.org. I can type it in the chat if you'd like. So regenerativo.org.
Yeah, please. We'll put it in. We'll put all the info, obviously, on the show notes as well on this. Yeah.
Yeah. So regenerativo.org has been, that consortium of partners that we've been mapping, who is doing regenerative agribusinesses in Latin America, and that has been for over 2 years been more of I would say, academic exercise, because there's been a lot of Latin American universities involved in this mapping and like the characterization of the cases and like what qualifies as regenerative, what doesn't, and like the diverse reality of, indigenous-led Ecuadorian businesses like Wiñac, and like really corporate-based businesses, in large-scale industries like in Brazil. And so that kind of mapping, that kind of characterization, definitions, all of that has been going on for a couple of years now. And we want to move into, okay, but what is the investable case? What is the profitability of this transition? Like those data points, I think, are missing. And so we want to bring together the community in a central place, because Bogota is kind of like at the belly button perspective from Mexico to Argentina. And so making sure that the investors are listening to the regenerators and the regenerators are listening to the investors at the same time. So we want to bridge this community, but really make sure that this event is a first one of many to bring about the investment case of the Latin American regenerative investment transition. And so it's been over, I think, almost 15 years of the Latin American Impact Investing Forum, which is the FLI, that is hosted by New Ventures usually, always, in Mexico. And so that has been, the northernmost point for all Latin America to travel and gather there. And so we wanted to make sure that this was a little bit more central and that this was for the gathering of the regenerative tribe. And, that to make sure that we get together, we exchange learnings, but also build the investment case more systemically.
And do you see the investor community, let's say, local as well as global, the global north, starting to give, you say the big banks and the big financial institutions start to at least engage? Let's not say they're starting to invest, because that would be too scary. But do you see an interest in LATAM, especially the Spanish-speaking countries? Of course, this is a first event you're doing, or the first one of hopefully many. So let's see how many people make the trip and come. But what do you feel in terms of interest for the business case of regeneration on the continent?
So I think the interest is there. And I do want to say, there's an anecdotal example that I think is key to talk about. So for example, there was this hike of the price of cocoa, in the past several months, or maybe almost a year.
Or more,
and
yeah.
Part of that is because more than 60% of the cocoa sourcing of the world, globally, is coming from Africa, even though cocoa is native from Latin America. So when you have these climate vulnerabilities that are playing out everywhere, even the cocoa in Latin America is suffering, but it's suffering less than the one sourced in Africa. So I would say there's a huge role of Latin America going back to its essence, to its native agrobiodiversity, and really growing it here will make a difference in terms, I would think, of climate resilience. And that has really, there's so many supply chains that have cocoa as part of their keystone species. And I think it's one of the main species that is adored all throughout the world. It's like a religion, chocolate, and it's at risk.
Probably
and
chocolate,
so
coffee, and tea. Those are
exactly.
The
So I would say, one of those anecdotal examples of how the hike of that commodity really puts everything into perspective and really makes you think and go back to where is it native from and where can it thrive for longer and to be the global sourcing strategy. And also the other, I would say, key element is the actual decarbonization of supply chains of a lot of American corporations and Canadian corporations that are sourcing globally and that are now looking to source more from Latin America because it makes sense in terms of less GHG emissions and less traveled miles. So there's a lot of US and Canadian food systems transformation that needs to involve their, Mexican and Latin American partners. And so I think that is what is actually happening. So for example, last year in Mexico, the largest deal of regenerative agriculture happened. And it was super surprising to everyone. Imagine it is $25 million. It's a deal that it's with the Whole Foods as the off-taker in a very large scale farm in northern Mexico. And so basically they were used to being only the suppliers of like 4 commodities and now have diversified into I don't know how many more, but basically it has been an intergenerational transition of the family ownership, as well as the, I would say, debt investment from Responsibility, the Swiss asset manager. And so those kind of examples are, I would say, pointing towards the fact that this is an investment case and it's not just, the Pachamama philosophy that I'm always talking about and that people think I'm, barefoot and I don't know, like this makes sense. And so I think
it's both. It has to be both.
It's both.
But yeah.
It has to be both. It has to be both. But I think, some of those isolated data points have pointed towards the fact that if, there's so much going on in the U.S. transformation food systems, and they are very dependent on their Latin American partners. And so if they want to, if they want their U.S. food system to be transformed, they have to work with the Latin America food transformation as well. There's also a lot of European buyers in Latin America, and a lot of the European, I would say a lot of the regenerative food companies that we've mapped are exporting towards Europe as well. And since the European regulations are only getting higher standards and more rigorous, I think that is where this regenerative transition really has a business strategy that makes a lot of sense in this timing.
And so that's a perfect bridge actually to what we absolutely also have to talk about, which is your fund. Last time we talked, last time we talked on the podcast, there was definitely no fund, and now there is one. And so what was the reason to build that fund, to go into the fund business, which is especially fundraising for a first-time fund is, as I imagine, a lot of fun. No, not really. It's quite brutal and a very, very long journey, as anybody that's doing that now or has been doing that, probably listening to this can attest. And anybody that hasn't can only imagine. I think the first close for a first-time fund manager is somewhere between 18 months and 2 years. And that was before these hard times of 22, 23. So what's the reasoning to do that? I can see them imagine like there's more money needed in rural Mexico in terms of regeneration. So why did you decide to take up and take the glove and let's say start the fight?
So we actually said during 2019 that we were mapping out what was investable about biodiversity in Mexico. We're actually finding a lot of the pipeline that is currently part of the pipeline for the fund. So at the very beginning, we didn't set out to build a fund. We rather say, let's develop and cultivate the regenerative investments. And so we literally said there's a development phase or a development layer that needs to happen before the funding phase. And so from that experience, we've been collaborating with a ton of different partners. So in 2020, we started a partnership called Sustainable Landscape Ventures that was funded by USAID. And so that partnership was implemented by Conservation International in Mexico. And so basically covered 3 key landscapes, which is Oaxaca, Chiapas, and the Mayan Peninsula in Mexico. And so these 3 key landscapes, I would say, have a lot of interests for USAID, especially migration, but also because it's the most biodiverse places in Mexico. And so it's like besides the Amazon is the other part of the really big chunk of rainforest that is available in Latin America still. And it's suffering a lot from deforestation. So I think having a Conservation International as that key partner that had landscape managers in each of these main landscapes. And so they acted both as a sourcing partner, origination partner, but also they were kind of filtering out what businesses, what organizations, what cooperatives were really aligned to local biodiversity and to social justice. And so really when they brought us organizations, they brought in, a lot of the Conservation International expertise of like what plays out with the local biodiversity. And so for us, we had the role of building a new investor community that was really interested and acknowledging, and not only acknowledging, but really valuing and cultivating regenerative investments. And so basically, we started building out an investor community for nature-based solutions. And so we organized 3 investor learning journeys within that project. So we are reversing technical assistance. We are not bringing a technical assistance to the rural communities, but rather the rural communities are giving the technical assistance to investors, because now investors come to listen and learn. And so with that, we really kind of brought about the dynamic of why the fund was needed. And so basically, the fund was needed precisely to bridge the ticket sizes between the need on the ground and the availability of capital in the asset managing space, and to bridge, of course, the mutual learning that needs to happen in this very nascent space for Mexico. And so within that Sustainable Landscape Ventures, we've been able to catalyze funding for over 30 organizations right now, rural organizations, ranging from honey producers through really diverse agroforestry systems and so many others. And so those organizations were funded by direct investments from the investors in our community. And
the group,
we have learned a lot forming that community, cultivating that community, and now proposing the fund to them. And so USAID was our first partner for building the fund. They really helped out with a grant support for us to structure the fund. Conservation International as a support partner also for like the sourcing and the relationships on the ground, the landscape level. And then now we found DFC as our anchor investor early this year. And then I hope we can be able to announce our second anchor investor soon, because it's not public yet, but it has been approved. So we're nearing our first close very soon.
When this goes out, you'll be at your first close, and you can find the press releases and stuff.
Hope so.
And so, what are the like not the technicalities, but the considerations you had while designing this fund? Because of course you want to somehow balance the tension between being as radical as maybe, let's say, the ground needs and the soil needs and the ecosystems need, and the people on the floor who are doing this real work need. And you don't want to be too radical for the financial markets, because then you're just not going to raise, or it's very difficult to raise significant. Like, what have been those considerations and maybe compromises as well?
Oof. So I would say one of the huge differences of our investment thesis versus what we can usually find in the US in terms of the regenerative funds, I would say a lot of the regenerative funds in the US are either debt for the transition, right? The other is land ownership strategies. So like really it's land acquisition and management.
Which I think is most of them in terms of dollar amounts. If you look at the amount invested, it's going to be land, real estate.
Yeah. And not just the US, right? That's plays out globally. And the third is like the tech investments, right? So we're not debt, we're not land acquisition, and we're not tech. So we're like really, I would say, a controversial strategy, or not controversial, but rather a contrarian strategy. Precisely because Mexico is a contrarian country, So rural land ownership in Mexico was revolutionized in the Mexican Revolution. So the Mexican Revolution, actually, the anniversary is tomorrow. So more than 100 years ago, the Mexican Revolution redistributed land ownership throughout Mexico. And so from like the very big land owners that were, very, very wealthy and usually came from the colonial history or the church. And like it really broke apart land ownership in Mexico and like really redistributed land. And so from that, land ownership in Mexico today, rural land ownership is really spread out, really distributed into a lot of smallholder farmers. And land acquisition is not as, I would say, practical or like readily available. So there is private land. Of course, there's a ton of private land, and I'm not saying there isn't, but many of the most biodiverse spaces are, of course, within the land that is still in a common land framework of rural and indigenous ownership. And so that really plays out in the fact that we are not a land acquisition strategy fund. And so we
simply
really
because
work,
you can't and you don't want to. Yeah.
we don't want to.
Yeah.
So we really partner with the usufruct of the land, like the actual produce of the land, instead of the land asset as an asset itself, right? And so we believe that is part of the social justice lens of our fund, precisely because it's that part of the contrarian work, I think has a lot of meaning towards what is driving degenerative practices. You know, there's a ton of over-centralized ownership and control that is playing out not just in the rural US, but everywhere in the world. And that goes against social justice. So there's a definition of of regenerative agriculture that we love, that comes from Eugenio Gras, which is Latin American. He already passed away. But in his definition, it's not only talking about the ecological and the soil health and the blah, 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 but rather the labor and the connection to land. So that is very similar to like Wendell Berry kind of philosophy, right? So I think we come from a philosophy that is very much pollinized by Bandana Shiva, by Wendell Berry, by Eugenio Gras in Mexico, in Latin America, by Maria Sevina and many other indigenous leaders in Latin America. But we think that if we are only talking about ecology without social justice, that's just gardening. Like, we really need to think about the redistributive quality of regenerative investments. It's not just the what you invest in, it's the how.
Let's repeat that one more time. Like, if we only talk about, I was laughing because it's such a good line. If we only talk about, what did you say exactly?
So this actually comes from the inspiration. So there's one of the environmental activists in Latin America that was shot to death in the 90s. His name is Chico Mendes. I think he was Brazilian. And so Chico Mendes said that ecology without class struggle is just gardening. So I always paraphrase his phrase, because this is his quote, but I paraphrase it like, ecology without social justice is just gardening. Like, we really need to bring in the social justice piece. This really needs to, like, it plays out also in Wendell Berry quote of the fact that we need to be tied to the land, and the land binding us and our labor towards it for the long term. And the long-term quality, you know, the ownership of the land really is part of the attractiveness of staying in the land and of, you know, putting your love to the land. You know, so really, for us, it is very important that rural communities stay in the ownership as much as possible of not only their land assets, but actually their companies. So, for example, we're not only bringing about an investment model that invests in regeneration, we're actually innovating with the self-liquidating equity or redeemable equity piece that I mentioned in the last episode. in depth. That is precisely, instead of putting farmers into debt, rather going with them to their growth strategy or transition strategy with our skin in the game and our risk as well for the long term. So like for over 7 years, right? So usually in Mexico, there's a ton of debt available. It's really, really expensive debt. In Mexico, we're never below double-digit interest rates, and you can even see triple-digit interest rates in Mexico play out. In microfinance, there's like over 100%, over 200% in microfinance rates in Mexico. So that's legal. So really expensive debt is widely available all towards Mexico. So we're not focusing on that, but rather the equity piece, so that we can be invested with like the skin in the game with them for their transition to happen.
And so how do you structure, like how does a fund like that land with investors? Of course, you've been cultivating this group for a while, so it doesn't come out of nowhere. And And how do you make sure you're still able to, of course, you're going to your first close now, but still able to raise enough to also have a difference? Because if you raise, I think the fund target is 20 million US dollars, which is significant. That's not 2 million left and right. Like, that's a significant amount. Like, how do you dance with that tension? And how has it been landing so far? Because it's not been easy a couple of years in terms of fundraising in general.
Absolutely. I think fund economics is definitely a huge challenge. Fortunately, within Mexican context, funds that are 20 million are okay in fund economics compared to what 20 million can do in the global north. We're actually aiming from 20 to 30. So we might go into the oversubscribed almost 30. I hope so. I'm not saying it's happening really soon, but I'm hoping and I'm aiming towards that. And it's precisely because we wanted a size that was significant enough to be able to play out as a learning strategy for the global north to learn of Latin American investment cases. But it has been super challenging. So I would say the timing is, we are in this very adverse fundraising timing, absolutely. But also the institutional big investors are really playing a role in the intersection of climate and gender. And that has definitely played a part for us. And that has really helped us out because we are two female managing partners, me and Stevie. And so I think that has really played out a significant role in terms of the institutional funding. So we got the institutional funders first instead of getting the private money. And so we've been fortunate enough that many of our actual investors are women leaders themselves within their own institutions. But as you know, there's several programs happening at the same time, like 2X is a gender equality or gender lens investing perspective for fund managers. USAID supported us as well because of that. We've also won 2 awards. So one from the International Climate Finance Accelerator in Luxembourg. They are amazing. And in their cohort, we won during 2023. In their cohort, we were the only Latin American fund, imagine. And they have global applications. They had over 100 fund managers applying that year. And we were the only ones from Latin America. So you can imagine how little this happens. And we've also won the recognition from the Climate Policy Initiative, CPI, the Climate Finance Innovation Lab. And so it's really different, those 2 programs, but they are super helpful, both of them. The ICFA is more like the accelerator for funds and fund managers from emerging markets into climate. And the CPI is like you can innovate in terms of it's not only for funds, but it can also be, for really alternative bonds and, things that are really wide ranging in terms of the type of instrument that you can be able to curate with them. And they offer really complementary support, both of them. But I think in both programs, I think part of our essential qualities that have brought about being supported by them has been the role of we are playing a role in climate adaptation that many have not played before. A lot of the climate finance has only been focused in mitigation in Latin America. And so climate adaptation is like a newer thing, and gender. And so the women leadership, I think, really plays a role.
And so
in the funding.
So how soon, of course, depending on funding coming in, but what are you targeting? And I could have checked the deck, but what are you targeting in terms of deployment? How soon is this fund? Will this money be out of the door? Let's say, how easy is it? I mean, you've been building pipeline, but how easy will it be to put 25, 30 million to work?
So we have been building this pipeline for over 4 or 5 years, and this pipeline has definitely grown and matured, and it has, for example, organizations that we've helped catalyze a very small ticket size, imagine $100,000 2 years ago from another investor, is now able to absorb maybe 500,000 or 100,000 more. So I think we have not only mapping them out, but really ecosystem building and being long-term relationship building with many of the companies that are now our targets. And so several of them, I would say several that are women-led, had not been looking for outside funding precisely because they have the fear of the mission drift, and they have the fear of, private capital coming into this exponential vortex, right? That
we started with. Yeah, it was going to be my next question. How do you make sure you don't fall into that vortex?
So I think that is why they find us as like a desirable partner for them, because we're not coming from that Silicon Valley mindset or perspective that, I mean, I don't have anything against Silicon Valley, but, that kind of exponential growth expectation. We're coming from a, yes, profitable expectation, but we are finding a multiple that is very reasonable for the redeemable equity, and that we will be tailoring and working with each company to see what works for them, instead of applying a single kind of, a single type of financing for everyone, because we do see that it's very different for the regenerators that are working at the retail level than the ones that are just only working on soil, and the ones that are building the infrastructure for nature systems to be paid for. So I think it's 4 layers that we are addressing. And since in Mexico we don't have that many competitors or many other regenerative funds, we really need to be very open and very tailored in each transaction that we do, because we will only be able to work with 10 to 15 companies at most. And so we have been able to get to know the ecosystem far enough that we know where we will probably be allocating those 10 to 15 investments kind of already, but we're still finding, every year we're finding and expanding our pipeline significantly.
And do you see this as, as often the fund management strategies are, we do a first fund, then we do a second, slightly bigger, et cetera, et cetera. Do you see that space in Mexico as well to do, I don't know, in a couple of years, maybe a 50 million or 40 million fund, or maybe it's a double strategy? Does it make sense to do similar, maybe different sizes, et cetera, in the rest of, let's say, Spanish-speaking Latin America? What do you see there as follow-up steps if this turns out to be successful?
So we're actually aiming for a second fund to be in Mexico, Colombia predominantly, and hoping to do a little bit around Mexico and Colombia, maybe Central America, precisely because we see the growth of the regenerative transition accelerating everywhere. And so we do see that. And since we already have a team in Colombia and we've been working with Colombia, right now SVX Colombia is in a partnership with Global Affairs Canada. So we have a budget from Global Affairs Canada that we're doing the grant strategy for since a couple of years ago. And so we've been able to grant organizations directly, accelerators and funds. So we're getting to know and pollinating the ecosystem in Colombia throughout many layers. And so the growth that we're perceiving from Colombia is really good timing for us to be starting to build those relationships and that knowledge to be able to do this in a second fund. So I'm not sure how much time will be between the first fund in Mexico used as the, let's say, investment case, and then expanding into Colombia. There will be maybe some years between that. But we're definitely already planting the seeds of what will be Regenera Asset Management. And so we already incorporated as Regenera Asset Management to be able to have Regenera Ventures Fund 1 and be able to have a second fund that spans, a bigger geography. The reason for this is that I think there's a lot of regional LATAM fund managers that are usually having, the cost benefit of that diversification is really expensive because you need to travel so much, and there's so many different time zones and so many accounting and fiscal considerations to going into all these Latin American currencies that is not minor. It plays a significant role. So we have talked to some fund managers, I'm not gonna name names, but that have acknowledged and accepted that kind of failure from their investment thesis, that they wanted to span all Latin America, and they have found that it's really expensive to do that. And the cost benefit usually is not playing out in their favor. So the fact that we're concentrating in specific countries is usually precisely to make very good use of the fund economics that are very tight, and like making, a very effective allocation as much as possible within the same fiscal and currency risks in each country. And so that specialization, I would say geographically, really makes sense. And also follows the fact that regeneration happens in a place level unit. And so we really need to focus on place rather than having, these really wide regions and like targeting millions and millions of hectares everywhere. I think we really need to get to know place. And that's the reason that we're also allocating in one country at a time.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. And I'm conscious of your time and want to also wrap up at some point, but I'm curious, will that follow, or do you see the similar, or what else is missing? Like, are there enough? You say in Mexico there's enough depth, but actually it's mostly completely inaccessible for any transition finance for farmers because of prices or because of interest rates. Like, do you see what are other big building blocks, let's say, of the financial puzzle that are missing currently in the LATAM market to really kickstart a regenerative transition? Is it depth?
I would say
other equity. Is it or just general consciousness, which also helps probably?
We need braver investors. We need braver investors that are comfortable being contrarian and not just followers. Because, when a big asset manager like Responsibility puts 25 million, then they look up, then they see, oh yeah, that sounds nice. They need to be brave enough to make the investment case and follow their hearts, So I think it really helps that the global north is doing this transition. It really helps that the US has all these data points and that Europe is, going into this transition as well, because a lot of the Latin American investor market is really following that. And so I think we are needing more brave investors, more brave fund managers that, we want to have competition. We want to have, and not just competition, but competitive partners or actual potential collaborators, because we want to build this as a systemic investment case, it's a fund as a learning opportunity, as a bridge to make this happen. But really, it's bigger than this, right? It's bigger than 20 million. It's an actual impact imperative. And so we really need to make food systems work. We really need to make biodiversity thrive again and people come alive, as Laura Storm says. So really, we want this to grow. We want this space to grow. And we found that there was we didn't find a lot of fund managers that wanted to be nature-based. Many just want to go with the flow of the tech-based. And so you have so much of the climate finance that is now tech-based, and really nature that can be multi-purpose solution always have 2 cents, So I think that that it's a lot about who's taking natural capital seriously and rural communities seriously. And I do want to mention some very long-term pioneers in the space, which is Eco Enterprises Fund, that has been going on for over 2 decades, and that they have led the way, they have paved the way, and they have, had this nature focus for a while. And I think we've been learning from their footsteps, and they have, an admirable path and leadership. And so we think it's the timing to have much more.
No, absolutely. And I want to thank you, of course, so much for the work you have been doing and coming on here in a very busy time. I mean, First Close is probably, I'm not saying as busy as it gets, but it's definitely a major milestone. So let's cross our fingers crossed for when this is out, that has happened or is about to happen. And thank you so much for coming on here and share so openly of lessons learned.
I forgot to mention one thing.
Go ahead. We don't have a format, so we can just keep going. I mean, I'm conscious of your time because I want to make sure you can go to your next meeting. But go ahead.
No. So I just wanted to mention that we also have one of the development finance institutions offer us first loss, which is precisely to be able to catalyze private investments, where we will be able to, name the investor and everything in a couple of months, maybe, or maybe in a month. This will be happening very soon, and it will be called SOIL, like the acronym will be SOIL. So it will be one of the very first.
What a surprise!
Yeah, it will be one of the very first losses in impact capital in Latin America, because that happens very seldom. Like it never happens. In Latin America, first loss is really hard to find. So it's part of those examples that will be both blended finance and regeneration. So we're very excited about that. Sorry that I hadn't mentioned.
And just for people to no. Sorry for people that they hear first loss, but they actually don't know what it means. In 2 sentences, why is that important?
It's super important because it enhances our risk return profile as a fund, being conscious and super acknowledging that we will be acknowledging a very risky market, a very climate vulnerable market, and there will be some things that will play out in our favor and some things that won't. And so these first loss will be able to return a principal and preferred return to private investors. So this means that in the case of a loss, this part of the investment will help in the payback. And if there isn't that loss, then that helps in adding to the return. So it's really
like
important
a cushion
and necessary. Yeah. Exactly. It's a cushion, and it helps out. It might even be expanded by another foundation later on, who knows? But it's really important that private capital jumps into this, and it isn't necessarily in terms of Mexican geography. And so that is why we're getting that. And it's also because we acknowledge the climate vulnerability that we're going into is really, really scary. Like Mexico is one of those countries that is really drought stricken in terms of like the water risk in Mexico, or the hydrological risk in Mexico, is really, really high. It's one of the highest in Latin America. And even with all of those risks that will be playing out, even with all of those risks, it's still riskier not to invest in it. So really super important to invest in the regenerative transition.
And that's a perfect way to wrap up. Thank you so much, Laura, for being here again and taking us with you on a journey, not only in Mexico, but actually further south, further central, let's say, and sharing why it's so important to look at the Spanish side and not only the Portuguese. Of course, give Brazil the attention it deserves, but the continent is a lot bigger. The continent plus actually the central part, of course, and it's such an immense important hotspot in terms of human side, environmental biodiversity. It's as you said, it's always riskier not to invest, which is probably an interesting sentence for many investors. So thank you so much for being here again and sharing your journey and keeping us up to date on what is happening on your end of the world.
Thank you so much, Cohen, and thank you to the community that is listening to this.
Thank you so much for listening all the way to the end. For the show notes and links we discussed in this episode, check out our website, investinginregenerativeagriculture.com/posts. If you like this episode, why not share it with a friend or give us a rating on Apple Podcasts? That really helps. Thanks again, and see you next time.